Hello, everyone. Welcome to our overview of HVAC and water heating measures webinar. It's currently 2 p.m., so let's get started. My name is Portia Baldad, and I'm the Marketing Manager for the Innerva and Summerhill team. Innerva and Summerhill are supporting Emissions Reductions Alberta with the design and execution of the Energy Savings for Business program. Thanks for joining us. Before we get started, let's go over a few housekeeping items. There are quite a few people attending today's webinar. As such, all microphones have been muted to avoid interruptions. Throughout the presentation, you can submit questions to our team through the control panel's questions tool. We will answer those questions during our Q&A period at the end of today's webinar. If you can't resolve your technical issues or need to leave early, we'll be posting a recording of these webinars onto the ESB program website. It'll include both the presentation and the Q&A session. Today, we'll begin with a brief program overview, including the eligible measures categories. We'll then review eligible HVAC and water heating technologies, program requirements, and the applications. We will then end the presentation with a Q&A period. Today, we'll receive a little background on the ERA and the Energy Savings for Business program team. Then my colleagues Patrick McMahon and Surya Narcia will jump in to guide us through eligible HVAC and water heating measures. Now, let's get into it. So reducing greenhouse gas emissions while supporting the economy benefits everyone. ERA's vision is anchored in the belief that our success is measured in both economic and environmental terms. Emissions Reductions Alberta has been investing in Alberta technologies and companies since 2009 to reduce emissions and grow Alberta's economy. Our investments help innovators develop and demonstrate GHG reducing technologies that lower costs, improve competitiveness, and accelerate Alberta's transformation towards decarbonization. We have worked across many sectors and have recently broadened our scope with the Energy Savings for Business program. This program will accelerate the adoption of commercially available technologies that will help businesses cut costs and reduce emissions. Learning from previous programs with similar scope, we have adopted the program to be more streamlined. We know time is money to Alberta businesses and are committed to fast turnaround times. For standard applications, this could be as quick as 2 days. The program has been designed to reflect the realities of the pandemic. Incentive payments will be made electronically, and all program materials are available in digital downloadable format that can be easily printed by contractors or participants. We have also expanded the measures list to include categories that have not yet been previously offered, such as geothermal and compressed air. We have also made sure to include measures that are accessible to all businesses, like ceiling and wall insulation, refrigerated case covers, efficient motor and lighting systems, and high-efficiency windows. We'll have over 300 measures to offer in this program. Our last measure release included HVAC, water heating, process heating, and building envelope and windows. These measures have now been added to the measures list. HVAC and water heating systems are essential to providing comfortable working conditions. Choosing efficient HVAC and water heating systems can significantly reduce utility costs and maintenance over time. We will continue to host more events like this one to help guide contractors and applicants through the program. If you missed any of the past webinars, we'll be posting them on the website. The motors and drives, solar and lighting system webinars are now live on the website. To register for future webinars or to view recordings of past webinars, please visit eralberta.ca//ESB. Before we get into the details of the HVAC and water heating webinar, we wanted to share a quick note about the application process. We are seeing incomplete applications submitted in order to secure a funding reservation. Submitting an incomplete application does not secure funding. If a pre-project application is submitted but it's not approved, it does not hold a place in line for the incentive reservation. The incentive is only reserved after the pre-project application is approved. It is important to submit good quality applications with complete documentation, or the review cannot occur in a timely manner. If the application is incomplete or is missing key information, it creates delays in the review and approval process, as it will be returned to you for more information. With that said, we're glad you can join us today to review HVAC and water heating measures. I'll now pass it off to Patrick and Surya to take you through how to apply for this category of incentives.
Thanks for that context, Portia. I'm Patrick McMahon, the Contractor Experience Manager on the Enerva and Summerhill team. We're proud to support Emissions Reduction Alberta through the delivery of the Energy Savings for Business program. Thank you for calling into the webinar today and for your early interest in the program. Today's webinar will cover measures identified under the HVAC and water heating categories from the measures list found on the program website eralberta.ca/ESB. We'll provide some context on each of the category groups, including a review of the specific components of the application process. Then, as Portia mentioned, we'll address some common attributes, including emissions assumptions and incentive calculations. The first measure category we will review is the HVAC measure category. This includes boilers, boiler controllers, heaters, and furnace measures, chillers and RTUs, air source heat pumps, VRF, and PTHP measures, then various ventilation measures, and finally pipe insulation. Let's get started with boilers, boiler controllers, heaters, and furnace measures. I'm joined by my colleague, Surya Narcia, who helped me understand these products and their fit within Energy Savings for Business program. Surya, I'm wondering if you could help me understand what specifically or practically would be included within this measure category.
Hello, everyone. Yes, for sure, Patrick. There are two types of projects where you can access the incentives. One where you are replacing old inefficient equipment with higher efficiency units. As such, new condensing boilers, condensing unit heaters, and high efficiency furnaces qualify for incentives when you are substituting old equipment. The other one is for retrofit projects. There are two types of projects that qualify. One is for upgrading an existing old dual stage burner to a new modulating one. And the other is for installing a vent damper on the flue pipe of a gas-fired boiler or furnace. Vent dampers are used to reduce off-cycle heat loss from the boiler or the furnace. The incentive value are based on $1 per MBH, so $1 per 1,000 BTUs per hour. And we'll provide more details on that in the following slides.
However, what about these measures make them high efficiency? And is that relative to existing technology or available technology?
Yes, condensing boilers or condensing unit heaters or high efficiency furnaces are common technology these days. They are specially designed to have additional heat exchange surfaces that can extract more heat from the flue gas, and therefore increasing the thermal efficiency of the system. However, they come at a premium price because of the engineering and high grade materials. And that's why the Energy Savings for Business program is trying to encourage and support businesses to make these investments so they can go the extra mile.
Thanks, Surya. Could you take us through the eligibility criteria?
Yes, for sure. So to qualify for the ESB program, condensing boilers and furnaces must be Energy Star certified. New furnaces must have a minimum annual fuel utilization efficiency, so AFUE of 96% to qualify. For condensing unit heaters, it is required that they be located in conditioned spaces. The incentives for burner conversion to a modulating burner caps at 2,500 MBH. And similarly, the incentives for installation of a boiler vent will cap at 2,500 MBH as well. And when applying for the incentives, you will have to submit the specification sheets for all of the new equipment. You must also provide information that is included on the nameplate of the existing equipment. And that includes capacity, efficiency, and age. You would need to also provide the specific application that the equipment is serving. For example, if it's a boiler serving domestic hot water or space heating, or is it both? So you would need to specify that. And lastly, you must also provide an estimate of the annual hours of operation.
Thanks, Surya. Let's take a tour through the application process for boilers, boiler controllers, heaters, and furnaces. This application review and the others in the webinar starts after the Add Measure button has been clicked through the Measure and Project Summary stage of an application. This is available to the participant or their contractor if granted access by the participant earlier in the application process. The user adding the measure will select HVAC as the measure category. The measure type will be the type of equipment being installed. Then the user will choose from a list based on the specific measures planned for installation from the eligible measures list. You will find that the description in the drop-down matches what is provided within the measures and minimum eligibility column from within the measures list. For products requiring an ENERGY STAR certification, much of the application is completed by providing the ENERGY STAR unique identifier for the product associated with the measure. This will include brand name, model number, fuel type, and efficiency. The quantity of this specific product will need to be listed. The specification sheet for this product will need to be uploaded by dragging the file into the gray area for the attachment or clicking the prompt to add the file. If you're installing more than one different product, you must add each product as a separate measure to the application by repeating these steps. The questions here reflect the boiler measure specifically, but are indicative of other measures in the category. For the boiler, it is required to provide the input rate in MBH, an estimate of the boiler system's operating hours, and a description of the application. Before clicking the Get Calculated Values prompt, you'll see assumed emissions reductions based on the measures selected, and ultimately the total emissions reduction, which is based on all the measures added to the application. We'll address these emissions and cost aspects of the application through a single view toward the end of the webinar. The next category we're looking to cover will be space and water cooling through chillers and rooftop units. Surya, can you help me understand what measures are included in this group?
Sure. In this group, we are incentivizing the replacement of old inefficient chillers and rooftop units with higher efficiency ones. The program will provide incentives for both positive displacement and centrifugal types of chillers, which can also be air-cooled or water-cooled.
What's the basis of the efficiency rating in this space?
Chiller efficiency must meet or exceed the requirements of the AHRI 550/590 standard, and that's based on the integrated part load values, the IPLV. We have classified the efficiency requirements for several capacity ranges, and the incentive rates would be different for each category. For example, an air-cooled chiller with capacity anywhere between 50 to 150 tons would get and would have to be having an EER of 16.44 or higher. Similarly, for the rooftop units, we will require a minimum of 12.5 EER to be eligible for incentive for capacity between 3 tons and 5.4 tons. So I would recommend to review the measures list for more details on that, the different categories. And the incentives here, they are paid at $1 per unit for each of the defined range, again, as you would see on the measures list.
In which sectors or parts of a business would these be applicable?
Chillers can be both for space or process cooling throughout a variety of commercial and industrial use cases. And incentives are available for units that are rated up to 300 tons of cooling capacity. Similarly, for rooftop units, they can be from any sector, and the incentives are available up to 63 tons.
Thanks, Surya. Could you take us through the eligibility considerations for chillers and rooftop units?
Yeah. So to be eligible for the program, the chillers or rooftop units must be utilized as primary equipment, not as a backup. It is required that the refrigerant in service comply with all the applicable codes and appropriate authorities. In terms of efficiency, it is required that chillers IPLVs rated kilowatt per ton be less than the qualifying efficiency, and they must meet the relevant ASHP 90.1 standard. For rooftop units, they are required to meet the minimum EAR value as specified in the eligible measures list. And when submitting an application for these measures, you must provide specification sheets for all new equipment again. And please also provide us with the capacity and the efficiency and the age of the existing equipment. It is important to specify what application is the chiller serving. For example, again, space cooling or process cooling or both. You must also provide the manufacturer's name and the model number. And finally, provide the estimated annual hours of operation.
Thanks again, Surya. Let's have a look at how to add these measures. And this time we'll use a rooftop unit to see the required fields for this measure type. This process starts after clicking the Add Measure button in the Measure and Project Summary stage of an application. And again, this functionality is available to the participant or contractors that have been granted access by the participant. The user adding the measure will select HVAC as a measure category. The measure type will be the type of equipment being installed. And for this example, we're selecting RTUS unitary AC. Then the user will choose from a list based on the specific measure planned for installation from the eligible measures list. This description will match what is listed in the measures and minimum eligibility column from within the measures list. The first question specific to this measure will ask how many units will be installed. The user will then be required to provide spec sheets for the new equipment. Similar to the boiler application, you're required to provide an estimate of annual equipment operating hours, and you must also provide the unit's heating capacity, the efficiency, the cooling capacity, and the energy efficiency ratio. The last few questions will ask for the brand name, and model number for the new unit. You will see the per unit emissions reduction, but the total emissions reduction field will remain blank. This will only populate after adding associated costs and clicking the Get Calculated Values button. Our next category of equipment in today's webinar provides both heating and cooling, air source heat pumps, variable refrigerant flow, and packaged thermal heat pumps. Surya, can you help me understand what measures are included in this group?
Absolutely. As you know, electric heating is very costly, but a lot of buildings are still having them. So this group of measures are incentivizing the replacement of electric heating with air source heat pump or variable refrigerant flow heat pumps or packaged terminal heat pumps as applicable. The heat pumps will also provide cooling at higher efficiency than the existing units.
In which sectors would these be applied?
Both air source heat pumps and VRF heat pumps can be found in any type of buildings. On the other side, the packaged terminal heat pumps would be probably most common in hotels or motels. That's it. There is no restriction as to which sectors would qualify.
What's the basis for the efficiency rating in these spaces?
The efficiency ratings can be found in the measures list. We've also classified the efficiency requirements for several capacity ranges and the incentive rates for each category. And I will go over the requirements in the next slide. In terms of efficiency, it is required that the air source heat pumps meet either the Consortium of Energy Efficiency Tier 1 or 2 for unitary heat pump, or the Northeast Efficiency Partnerships, Northeast Energy Efficiency Partnerships, the NEEP efficiencies for cold climate air source heat pump specifications. Similarly, for the variable refrigerant heat pumps, they must meet the CEE Tier 1 COP requirements, or they must be verified, or they must be certified by the AHRI as a variable refrigerant flow heat pump. For packaged terminal heat pumps, they must be certified by AHRI, or they must be compliant with the NRCan Energy Performance Standard for PTEC or PTHP, or packaged terminal heat pumps. As a reminder, this group of measures are only eligible when they are replacing electric heating and cooling. When you are applying for these measures, you must provide specification sheets for all of the new equipment. And we also require certain information pertaining to the existing systems in operation, such as the type of heating or cooling system in place, which will eventually be replaced. We need the nameplate efficiency and the capacity data for both cooling and heating. Provide the manufacturer's name and the model number. And finally, an estimate of the annual hours of operation.
With the requirements known, as Surya summarized, the addition of these measures follows a similar process. This process starts after clicking the Add Measure button in the Measure and Project Summary stage of an application. This functionality again is available to the participant or contractors that have been granted access by the participant. The user adding the measure will select HVAC as a measure category. The measure type will be the type of equipment being installed. For this example, we've selected air source heat pumps or variable refrigerant flow. The specific measure added will be based on the capacity of the system, which you will select from the drop-down menu. You'll need to provide the number of units that are being installed as well as the spec sheet. The annual operating hours of the equipment will be required, and the system capacity in tons needs to be provided. You must also state if the measure is replacing electric heat and provide a description of the type of cooling system being replaced. Then you must submit the rated efficiency of the new unit. For heating, this will be the Heating Seasonal Performance Factor, or HSPF, and for cooling, this will be the Seasonal Energy Efficiency Ratio, or SEER. You're required to provide the product manufacturer name, system or model brand name, and the specific model number. You will see that the per unit emissions reduction is based on the total emissions, but so you will see the per unit emissions reduction, but the total emissions reduction field will remain blank. This will only populate after adding associated costs and clicking the Get Calculated Values button. Let's continue with HVAC measures, but more specifically ventilation. Surya, can you help me understand the acronym and scope of this measure, and how do they support the goals of the ESB program?
Sure. So HRV, the heat recovery ventilator, or the ERV, energy recovery ventilator, and destratification fans, they are typically auxiliary mechanical ventilation devices that they assist in improving the efficiency of the overall HVAC system. HRV and ERV would recover energy from the exhaust air. And a destratification fan would move hot air that usually stays close to the ceiling and redistribute it back to the floor space level and mixes the air. A demand control ventilation system, or DCV, modulates the ventilation requirement to maintain indoor air quality through the use of CO2 sensors. And the makeup air unit provides fresh air into the building to maintain indoor air quality.
On what basis are the incentives paid for these measures?
So for the ERV, the HRV, and the makeup air unit, incentives are paid at $1 per 100 CFM. The higher the CFM, the higher the incentives. For the DCVs, they are paid by the number of, so it's $1 per CO2 sensor. And for the destratification fan, it's $1 per fan.
Thanks, Surya. Can you tell us more about the eligibility?
Absolutely. To be eligible for incentives, the HRV and the ERV, they must meet the minimum effectiveness of 65% at 32 degrees Fahrenheit. They must be compliant with ASHRAE 62.1, and they must not be located where you already have a DCV or temperature setbacks in use, or where 100% exhaust air must be removed from the building to avoid cross-contamination. There are certain buildings that have this requirement. If your application includes the condensing makeup air unit, then these must be gas-fired units, and they must meet the minimum thermal efficiency of 90% to qualify. To submit, and then continuing with the eligibility for DCVs, they must be installed in a constant volume HVAC system. The control space must be a minimum of 1,000 square feet. The system must be compliant with ASHRAE 62.1. They must not be located where the energy or heat recovery is in use. and must only be for previously non-controlled ventilation. So you're adding new sensors. Lastly, for the destratification fans, they must be installed in buildings that have space heating. And the minimum fan diameter is a 20 feet requirement and a minimum ceiling height of also 20 feet. To submit an application, you are required to provide specification sheets and thermal efficiencies for all the new equipment. You must also provide the capacity, the efficiency, and annual operating hours for the existing HVAC equipment. And if you're replacing a makeup air unit, you must also submit the manufacturer's nameplate data showing the CFM, the make, the model for the existing makeup air unit that will be replacing.
Thanks, Surya. Let's move on to the application. To add a ventilation measure, as is true with other measures we've covered, the user will click the Add Measure button from the Measure and Project Summary stage of an application. The user adding the measure will select HVAC as the measure category. The measure type will be the type of equipment being installed. And here we've chosen an energy recovery ventilator as the measure type. Within the measures list, we could find that there is only one specific measure associated with this measure type. And as a result, the only measure available is the energy recovery ventilator. The measure-specific information for the energy recovery ventilator, as with all measures, starts with the quantity of the specific product expected to be installed. A spec sheet is required and is uploaded by dragging the file into the gray box or clicking for a prompt to explore and find the document. Similar to other measures, the estimated annual operating hours is required. The rated cubic feet per minute of the ERV is required, and the sensible heat recovery percentage. To evaluate the emissions reduction potential, the input rate of the heating system in MBH is required, as well as the rated efficiency of the heating system. The last values to input before allocating project costs to the specific measure include the device manufacturer name, and model number. We've covered a lot of ground here, Surya. Thanks for your help with these. And speaking of covering a lot of distance, we're moving to the final HVAC measure, pipe insulation. Where could building owners and contractors find opportunities to take advantage of this measure?
So any hot fluid or cold fluid applications, especially space heating, space cooling, or even domestic hot water systems, these are very good applications where you would need insulation.
Isn't this already a common practice?
Yes, absolutely. But the idea here is to encourage participants to improve the existing insulation by adding layers to achieve a minimum of R value of 2.5. If they don't have that already, so here's an opportunity to add layers. It is also possible that there are damaged insulation or bare pipes in certain areas. So the ESB program is a good opportunity for businesses to claim incentives and insulate those pipes. Let's go to the eligibility and the requirements on the next slide. So when you're applying, you must provide the specification sheet and ensure that the pipe insulation has a minimum R value of 2.5. The pipe insulation must also be made of any of the following materials. So there could be elastomeric foam, rubber, polyethylene foam, UV resistant polyethylene foam, mineral wool, fiberglass, polyurethane foam, rigid phenolic foam, cellular glass, or calcium silicate.
Adding pipe insulation to an application from the Measures and Project Summary by clicking Add Measure starts with selecting HVAC from the measure category dropdown, then pipe insulation as the measure type. There are two eligible measures in this category, indoor pipe insulation and outdoor. Once the measure has been selected, provide the number of pipes having insulation added within the application, and then upload a spec sheet for the product. The annual equipment operating hours should reflect the uptime of the equipment producing the heat in the pipes being insulated. Similarly, the heating system input rate and heating system efficiency should reflect the capacity of the heat source feeding the pipes being insulated. For applications with multiple pipes being insulated, the length of insulation in feet will need to reflect the average for all pipes, and the same is true for the diameter, although less critical. For pipe insulation, the incentive is calculated based on the dollar value per foot, 2 pipes, each 100 feet, is 200 feet to multiply by the incentive rate associated with each foot of pipe being insulated. To try to summarize for understanding, the quantity of pipes multiplied by the length of insulation multiplied by the incentive rate per foot will define the incentive for the pipe insulation. Pipe insulation makes for a good segue towards water heating. Surya, can you tell me about the measures included within the water heating category?
Yes, so this is a set of incentives for replacing hot water heaters for domestic use within commercial buildings by high efficiency condensing water heaters. Rebates are available for both storage tanks and tankless heaters. Additionally, the program is also incentivizing water heater jackets where appropriate, and this will be insulation that can be applied to insulate the whole tank. The incentives for the water tanks are based on $1 per MBH, while for the water jacket, it's a fixed amount per jacket.
Thanks, Surya. Could you tell us a little bit more about the eligibility for these?
Sure. So to be eligible for the program, water heating systems must have a thermal efficiency of 90% or more. Condensing storage or tankless heater types must also be Energy Star certified. And lastly, for the water heater jackets, they are required to have a minimum or value of 6. And to apply for water heating incentives, applicants must provide the specification sheets and the Energy Star unique ID. If you're replacing a water heating system, you must also provide the input rate in MBH, the volume of the tank, if that's applicable, and the approximate age of the system, of the existing system that is being replaced.
When adding a hot water measure to an application from the measure and project summary stage of an application, a participant or contractor, if access had been granted by their customer, the participant, will select water heating as the measure category and then the water heating product from the measure dropdown. The specific measure to add will be selected based on the capacity of the system. The description of the specific measure to select will match what is listed in the measure and minimum eligibility column from within the measures list. Since Energy Star is an eligibility requirement for the water heating components within for these measures, the Energy Star product ID is required. When the Get Calculated Values button is clicked, a correct Energy Star ID will lead to the fields associated to the brand name, model, and model number, and others to be populated. The user will still need to upload a spec sheet for the product by dragging a file into the gray area or clicking to prompt the opportunity to explore and find the correct file. The user will need to define the water heater input rate in MBH, the capacity of the tank being replaced, the input BTU per hour of the tank being replaced, and the age of the tank or tanks being replaced before moving on to allocating project costs. This brings us to the common emissions and cost section of the measure addition module when adding measures to an application. As was mentioned in other application walkthroughs, the per unit emissions reduction reflects the static per measure assumed emissions reduction, and the total emissions reduction reflects an estimate based on some of the measure specific variables entered through the measure additions sections we have previously covered in this webinar. It will be calculated when the user ultimately clicks on Get Calculated Values. This is the place to input measure costs, separated by equipment and material costs, labor costs, and design costs. If multiple measures will be included on a single application, costs such as labor for installation or eligible design or audit costs should be allocated across the various measures to be included on the application. Where costs are allocated across multiple measures on a single application, it would be helpful, as a tip, to share how costs were allocated in a document added at step 5 in the application process. That's the step where documents about the project are uploaded. Please note that labor costs should only reflect costs associated with installation, while other costs excluding equipment and material costs should be allocated to the design cost field. The rebate application also includes 3 values relating to the incentive that will be calculated when the Get Calculated Values button is ultimately clicked. Understanding these values in the context of the program may be helpful. The first is the measure incentive, which is the per unit incentive and can be found on the measures list. The maximum eligible measure incentive reflects the incentive cap applied to the sum of eligible costs, material installation and design costs. For example, if the sum of costs was $100,000 and the incentive cap was defined at 50%, the maximum eligible incentive would calculate to $50,000. If the per unit incentive times the number of units is less than the maximum eligible incentive based on the application of the measure cap on the total costs, then the total eligible measure incentive will reflect the measure incentive multiplied by the measure quantity. If the per unit incentive times the number of units is greater than the maximum eligible measure incentive based on the proportion of eligible costs, then the total eligible measure incentive will mirror the maximum eligible measure incentive. The incentive is the lower of the maximum eligible measure incentive or the measure incentive times the quantity of measures. After the Get Calculated Values button is clicked, the application will identify any missing fields. If all fields are present, take this opportunity to review the measure set to be added for accuracy before clicking to add the measure to the application. This process and this advice is repeated for other measures to be included as a part of the project at this facility. Let's work through a practical example before we start to take some questions. In this example, we have a hotel planning an upgrade of 121 guest rooms with replaced PTHPs and a 1500 MBH condensing boiler. The measures will be added separately to one application as showcased earlier. For the PTHP upgrade, it has a project total cost of $96,800. The total eligible measure incentive is $24,200. This is the lower of the maximum measure incentive based on the total eligible costs multiplied by the 50% incentive cap for HVAC measures, and the calculation of the number of units, 121, times the per unit measure incentive of $200 per unit. Similarly, for the condensing boiler with a cost of $42,200, the incentive would be $18,000 since the measure incentive based on $12 per MBH times the 1500 MBH capacity of the boiler is lower than the maximum eligible measure incentive based on the 50% of eligible costs. And with that, I'll hand it back to Portia to kick off the Q&A session of the webinar.
Thanks, Patrick. So we received a lot of great questions during the presentation. Patrick Soria and Emissions Reductions Alberta's Alison and Enerva's Myron Sirkantha will be here to help answer them. If we don't get to your question today, please submit it to the esbprogram.ca and our contact center team will be happy to respond to you one-on-one. So let's get to it. Right. So Patrick, I think this question is best for you. Can you please make clear, can you apply for more than one incentive in an application? And
Sure. So there are some kind of general eligibility criteria to consider around maximum project incentives, and that the measures need to reflect a single facility for the project application. But if multiple measures are taking place, even from different categories outside of HVAC and water heating, for instance, they can all be added to the single project application. So stage 3 in the application process is adding measures. You would hit add measure, define the measure being added, add it to the project, and then repeat that process by hitting the add measure button again at that stage of the application process to add the measures that would be part of that single project application.
And what advice would you give to an applicant looking to install more than one measures category?
Yeah, so there's definitely a lot to consider depending on the scope of the project taking place, but there are some thinking around the timeline. The application, when multiple measures are added to a single application, will move at the pace of the slowest measure. So if you created a project that had a variety of measures that were going to be installed over a long, various stages of a project, the application will only be able to be submitted for final approval and incentive payment once all of the measures on the application are complete. So you may choose to break up a measure by expected stage of completion of a project. You may choose to create a project application based on a category of vendors doing work. So if you were working with an HVAC contractor for a specific scope, you could create an application for that and then work potentially with another vendor, maybe a lighting vendor or a solar vendor, to define a different project for that site. The general eligibility considerations around the maximum incentive per project of $250,000 or per parent company of $500,000 need to be considered, as well as the $100 minimum incentive per application. So there may be a need to group smaller applications or a smaller quantity of applications to get above the $1,000 threshold. But if that's not a concern, then you may choose to break it up based on time, based on different contractor groups, or as you see fit. And if you need additional clarification or advice, it's definitely an opportunity to reach out to the program team.
Thanks, Patrick. Myron, do we have you on the line? I have a question that I think is best suited for you.
Hi, Portia, I'm here.
Hi, awesome. So the question is, I've noticed that the incentives for RTUs and chillers are very low. Why are they set at these levels? Can you provide a little insight on that?
Hi, Portia, I'm happy to answer that question. So for the RTUs and chillers, the incentive setting process, we looked at several different factors. For RTUs and chillers, what we did was we looked at the climate data, and it essentially indicated that the equivalent full load cooling hours are pretty low. That means that the emissions reduction potential is lower, which meant that from a cost effectiveness point of view, the incentives couldn't be higher than what we had to pick. Now, obviously, we understand that for some buildings, they do have higher cooling requirements. For example, say a data center or a telecommunications building. The only issue is, though, is for the application, we can't say only buildings that are telcos or data centers can apply and others can't. So to be essentially fair to everyone, we had to pick an incentive that fitted with the whole program. So that's why we did it that way.
Thanks, Myron. I think this is also a question for you. Why do the chiller requirements cite ASHRAE 90.1 instead of the local energy code?
That's a great question. So what we did was when we looked at some of the efficiency requirements, we found that when we did talk to the HVAC community, we did find that there was quite a lot of familiarity with ASHRAE 90.1. It is one of the key design standards. So we were comfortable going with that standard when specing a minimum requirement. We're happy to also look at the other codes as well and see if that's something that can be applicable. But for now, we have gone with the ASHRAE 90.1 standard.
Great, thanks, Myron. Surya, I have a question for you. Do RTUs of 11.5 tons and larger require I can never say this word, economizer?
Well, while the eligible measures list does not specify the requirement for an economizer as such, it is assumed that these units will have an economizer. In order to meet the efficiency levels that we have specified, we are assuming that they will be coming with an economizer already. And if you have examples of these units that meet the efficiency requirements for an EER without having an economizer, please let us know at any cost. And if you have anything that's different as well, let us know. We are happy to look into the applications and discuss further.
Thanks, Surya. I think I have another question for you. For chillers, is there a plan for any incentives for non-HVAC chillers, for example, arenas of food processing industries?
So just like Myron also explained, so the actual incentive has been modeled for space cooling, and we've looked at the climate data for those, and obviously that's how the incentives have been calculated. Right now, process chillers for other applications are not included. We'll probably take that back to the team, and we'll see. We'll do some assessment and see whether these measures could be potentially included at a future stage. So for now, they're not included. Yes, Myron, please go ahead.
I can add a small clarification. So you're completely correct. We didn't do the modeling on the process side because that would be extremely custom based on the application for the process. What is important to note is you can apply for your chiller rebate if it is a process chiller upgrade. The measures list does say that both chillers for HVAC or process cooling are eligible. But please be aware, one of the reasons the incentives are lower is because it was modeled on the HVAC use case. So just please be aware of that.
Thanks, Myron. Just to follow up with that, Myron, I think you'd be the best person for this question. How were the incentive amounts calculated for the HVAC retrofits?
Sure, Portia. So for incentive amounts, essentially for any measure, HVAC or other, we look at a bunch of different factors. So we look at the cost of the equipment. We look at what the incremental cost of replacement would be. So for example, going from a standard option to a more efficient option. We also look at the energy savings and emissions reduction potential of the technology and what the emissions reduction would be if you installed a certain project. And then the final thing we also look at is the participant's perspective. So what they see from a payback perspective. And not always all three of those, or not always all four of those things are going to align. So we do have a blended approach where we do try and balance different factors. So to make sure that both the participant can, if possible, get a good incentive, but also to make sure that the Alberta ratepayer and taxpayer is making sure that their funds are being used effectively to combat emissions reduction.
Thanks, Myron. Okay, so our next question is, I have a boiler project I'm considering that is too large to be on the Energy Star list. What do I do? Surya, can you provide a little bit of clarification on this question?
Yes, for sure. We understand that for some boilers, they are too large for the Energy Star list. Actually, the Energy Star list stops at 2000 MBH. Currently, we are assessing how to include those larger boilers in the program. And we are expecting to have an update in the next couple of weeks on the results of the assessment. So that's a work in progress right now. And let me add an additional detail on that. Probably some people might be concerned about the deadline for submission for projects that have been incurred, that have been implemented after November 2nd last year. So for those measures, obviously, we are going to provide the necessary timeline, which is going to be later than the current deadline for submission of those costs for the applications. Hope that helps.
Thanks, Surya. So our next question is, for the furnace applications, where would we add the details about the equipment to be replaced? Patrick, can you just clarify which step in the application process that would be?
Right, so where that's required will always be part of the measure addition module. So step 3 in the application process, add measure, and then as required, the information about the existing equipment would be prompted for data input through the addition of every measure. So you kind of think of adding a new product, but some of those addition of new products do ask questions about what's the old product.
Thanks, Patrick. So our next question is, I want to install demand control ventilation in a multi-zone facility. Is that eligible? Surya, I think this question would be for you.
Yes. So for the incentive, as we've talked earlier, the sensor has to be, one of the eligibility requirements is that the sensor has to control a single zone and a constant volume system. So if you have multiple zones, then you would need to apply, you would need multiple sensors. So like it will be one sensor for each zone. So definitely that is eligible. You can apply that way.
Great, thanks, Surya. Myron, I think I have a question for you. Why is the limits applied to burner and burner controls up to only 2,500 MBH units? Big buildings and large industrial clients have bigger units and use more fuel and have major fuel saving potential.
Hi, so that's a great question. When we looked at that, what the intention there was to essentially cap the incentive at the 2,500 MBH times the dollar per MBH incentive value. We can look at that and possibly say the incentive could be capped at a certain value, but will allow larger boiler sizes. So that's definitely something we can take back and look at. That's a great question. Thank you for that.
All right, in terms of providing feedback, are there any plans to review and modify incentives based on contractor and participant feedback?
So we're always looking to get input into what the market thinks with regards to the incentives. So happy to take your feedback. Obviously, with the measure incentives, they are what they are, and as we are planning to do another release soon, we will see what updates we can make. But happy to have a discussion on what people think with regards to getting market feedback for sure.
Thanks, Myron. Just as a reminder to everyone, the full measures list is available on the ER Alberta website. So if you go to eralberta.ca/ESB, you'll see that there is a button for program resources, and that's where the measures list, as well as the participant terms and conditions live. It's a great resource. I see there are a lot of great questions that are being asked during the question and answer period that can be answered by taking a look at those resources. Again, if we don't get to your question and if it's not in our FAQs or any of those documents, please feel free to get in touch with our contact center team. They'll be happy to point you in the right direction. And then I think I have one more question for the team. So Surya, if you can just quickly answer this question. Is there a limit in how many destratification fans can be installed in a building?
Absolutely no. The way this the incentive has been set, the incentive is per unit of fan, so there is no limit. And the one criteria to pay attention is actually the diameter of the fan. That's one of the requirements. So you're looking at 20 feet. So obviously, depending on the size of the building and the height and the size, the square footage, you can only fit that many fans that would work over there. So as such, there's no limit, but yeah, pay attention to the other minimum requirements.
Yeah, we could add that there is a practical engineering limit for where the number of fans makes sense. So during
Absolutely.
the application review process, definitely we'll be looking at the number of fans that an application has and whether it makes sense for the size of condition space that is provided.
Great. Perfect. Thanks, Myron and Surya. And all right, so I think that's all the time that we have for questions today. If your question wasn't covered or you have more questions, we do encourage that you visit the ESB program website. Again, we have a lot of fantastic resources there, such as the FAQs, the measures list, the terms and conditions. Fantastic resource. If you have a question about your specific situation or you can't find the answer in those resources, you can feel free to contact our contact center team. They'll be happy to guide you through that. Right. We also have There's also a great resource on that website. We have a one sheet that can be distributed to clients, so we encourage you to check that out. You can download it and email them to any interested parties. So definitely check out the website there. Great. And as a reminder, we'll be posting the recording of this webinar on the Energy Savings for Business webpage listed above. You can also find links to the portal. And we also have the recordings of the last set of webinars up on there as well. Here on this slide, you can see that this is all the contact information that we have for our contact center team. You can reach them by email, by phone, or by chat on the ERA website and the program portal. We also have a number of webinars slated for this month. The full schedule will be available on the ERA website shortly. Please sign up to the newsletter to receive the latest program news and update. Perfect. So that wraps up today's webinar. Thank you, and we hope to see you at the next one.